welcome to Chapter 4, where we are going to talk about ethics and social responsibilities of businesses and managers and things like that. So, first up, we're going to start talking about workplace deviance. So, what is that? So, let's start with a little bit of context, right? Managers of a business, owners of a business, employees of a business are expected to do the right thing. Regardless of what that is, they're expected to do the right thing. However, no matter what they do, they'll most likely always end up upsetting someone, right? Someone will always be upset, offended, whatever you want to call it. You can't please everybody, is a great way to describe it. Managers don't always have the option to choose a win-win scenario, which leads us to ethics, right? Sometimes people end up getting hurt, and that brings us to ethics, which is the set of moral principles or values that defines right and wrong for a person or group. So some interesting statistics is that only 55% of people believe that management is actually telling the truth, and only 25% trust business leaders to honestly correct mistakes. So you can see right off the bat that it's not always a great thing. And we as business leaders need to correct that. Which brings us to ethical behavior, right? Which is when we follow accepted principles of right and wrong, right? Experts estimate that unethical behavior can cost companies upwards of $4 trillion per year, right? So let's step back for a second. Accepted principles of right and wrong. Essentially what that means is what we as a society or we in the business world consider right or wrong, right? What's right? Treating people well, respecting others. What's wrong? Stealing from your company, stealing from customers or employees, right? Right and wrong. Sometimes it's not always as clear and black and white as I just described, though. So that's where a little bit of interpretation comes on in. That brings us to workplace deviance, finally, which is unethical behavior that violates the organizational norms about right and wrong. So those are the norms, or if you don't remember, norms are essentially the rules and the principles that the business or the organization has set up, right? And that has of what is right and wrong, like what should you or should you not do. So workplace deviance is when you're outright breaking those rules and it violates those rules. So company-related deviance can affect both tangible and intangible assets, right? So what does that mean, right? It could affect your physical assets that you have. It could also affect intangible assets such as your brand or your name recognition, right? Tangible assets, they might damage a car. They might steal some product or maybe even damage a machine out of defiance, right? But intangible, it's not physical, right? It's something that is intangible, for a better or worse word. And there are 4 types of deviance. There's production deviance, property deviance, political deviance, and personal aggression. So let's first start with production deviance. So deviance that hurts the quality and quantity of a product or the company. So examples of production deviance would be leaving work early, taking long work breaks, intentionally working slower, or wasting resources, right? And, to be honest, we've probably all done this before, right? Where 89% of employees state that they waste time at work. I've done it before, and I'll probably do it again at some point in my life. Nobody's 100% efficient. Most common offense is something called cyber loafing. So what is that? It's essentially wasting time while you're on social media. Then we have property deviance, which is unethical behavior aimed at company property or products. So examples could be sabotaging, stealing, damaging equipment, products, overcharging for services, things like that. And it leads to employee shrinkage, which is when employees steal company merchandise. And this accounts for about 23% of theft from U.S. retailers and costs on average about $9.7 billion each year for the business landscape. That's billion with a B. That's a whole lot of money. And it costs more than shoplifting does. So people who are outright stealing that don't work for the company, they steal less product than property deviance causes damage equivalently. Up next, you have political deviance. So, political deviance is using one's influence to harm others in the company. So examples could be making decisions based on favoritism and not performance, spreading rumors, or blaming others for mistakes that you made, right? So when you think of a workplace that's political, that might come to mind. Finally, you have personal aggression, which is essentially the most hostile form or aggressive behavior that could be engaged in the workplace. And essentially, it's hostile or aggressive behavior towards other individuals. Examples could be sexual harassment, verbal abuse, stealing from coworkers, or personal threats to those coworkers. Thankfully, because of a lot of different social justice movements that have occurred, workplace violence has dropped significantly to only 2.1 incidents per 10,000 full-time employees. Now, one incident is too many. One person getting hurt is too many. But this is significantly better than what it used to be like 30, 50, 70 years ago, right? We're always getting better. So essentially what I wanted to pose to you is, if we were in person, would be asking you some of these questions here about what is ethical and unethical, right? But let's jump back into the normal lecture, which is the U.S. Sentencing Commission for Organizations. So what is that? Nearly all businesses are covered by the Sentencing Commission Guidelines Manual. So what is it? It's essentially the program requires, it's a program that requires regular audits. It requires that a company has codes of conduct, ethical standards, and anti-bribery and corruption policies as part of this sentencing commission, which is an overall organization that's designed to try and make the workplace more safe. Right? It's designed to try and reduce unethical behavior. And the guidelines that they cover are covered or defined by federal laws. And the purpose of these guidelines is not just to punish offending companies, but to encourage companies to take proactive steps to prevent crime before it actually happens. So, with that organization, they need to determine punishment, right? If they're the judge, they're also the jury and executioner of this. So, determining the punishment is going to be based on guidelines, right? So the U.S. Sentencing Commission guidelines impose smaller fines on companies that take proactive steps to encourage ethical behavior, or if they voluntarily disclose illegal activities to federal authorities. So what this means is that they say, well, you know what? As long as you're willing to tell us that something happened in the workplace, your workplace will be fined less. If you are willing to put in policies and procedures in place to reduce unethical behavior, you will have to pay less of a fine, right? And this is a great thing because hopefully it reduces the number of incidences that occurs in the workplace. And the exact fine can actually be calculated with a chart that you could find online. And to avoid paying those large fines, like I was saying, you need to have a specific guideline, certain criteria with 7 necessary components of an effective compliance program to try and avoid ethical issues. So let's briefly talk about influences on ethical decision making. So some of this boils down to something called ethical intensity. Now we're really starting to getting into the ethics conversation. So ethical intensity is the degree of concern people have about an ethical issue. When addressing issues of high ethical intensity, managers are more aware of the impact their decisions will have on others. And there are 6 factors that must be considered when determining ethical intensity of a decision, right? So essentially what this is saying is that a more severe or a more intense ethical situation will require a faster action or a different type of response versus something that's less of an ethical issue. A manager or a business owner is going to say, all right, if there's sexual misconduct in our workplace, that's something we need to address today, as soon as possible, immediately. Versus you find out one of your employees stole some toilet paper, right? Very different situations. And they require a very different type of response. One, you could say, all right, I'll wait. I'll gather a little more information. I won't yell at this person or reprimand them, or I won't approach them yet. And the other situation is figuring out what happened immediately and trying to make sure that everybody else is safe. So let's talk about these 6 factors to consider when determining ethical intensity of an action. So first up is magnitude of consequences, which is the total harm or benefit derived from an ethical decision. The second is social consensus, which is an agreement on whether behavior is bad or good. And third is probability of effect, the chance that something will happen that results in harm to others. Let's bring it to 4, is the temporal immediacy, which is the time between an act and the consequences the act produces. So this will be stronger if a manager has to lay off workers next week as opposed to 3 months from now, right? That ethical issue is closer in when you have to fire them next week versus, all right, I can deal with it 3 months from now. Number 5 is proximity of effect, which is a social, psychological, cultural, or physical distance of a decision maker from those affected by his or her decision. So that's the proximity. Proximity is greater when a manager lays off employees he or she knows, compared to laying off employees he or she does not know. Which, in other words, is to say that a manager or a business owner, if they had to lay off workers that he or she would consider close friends of theirs, that's going to be a lot different and probably more difficult for them compared to laying off people you've never even met before. And then finally, we have concentration of effect. How much of an act affects the average person? So an example would be eliminating healthcare coverage for 100 employees has a greater concentration of effect than reducing the healthcare benefits of 1,000 employees. So that brings us to practical steps to ethical decision making, right? We need to know how we can make an ethical decision, right? That would be great, right? Because we as managers and future business owners and business leaders need to figure out how do we act as ethical as possible, right? So first off, starts with selecting and hiring ethical employees. So you could start with something called an overt integrity test, which estimates the job applicant's honesty by asking them directly what they think or feel about theft or about punishment of unethical behaviors. So an example would be an employer might ask the applicant, would you ever consider buying something from somebody if you knew that person had stolen that item, right? And that's trying to measure how ethical that person is, right? There's also something called a personality-based integrity test, which indirectly estimates the job applicant's honesty by measuring psychological traits such as dependability and conscientiousness. I had to practice saying that one. Up next is codes of ethics. So all large corporations have an ethics code in place. If you want to be listed on the NYSE or the New York Stock Exchange, a company must adopt and disclose its code of ethics, right? So it's kind of like their rules, their regulation. They're saying, hey, this is our rules to follow if we want to be considered ethical. For a code of ethics to do anything for a business, though, 2 things need to happen. The company must communicate its code to others, both inside and outside of the company. And in addition to having an ethics code with general guidelines, management also develop practical ethical standards and procedures specific to the company's business. So they need to figure out exactly how do we get this information to them and how do we make sure that they know, which kind of leads us to ethics training. So in addition to having a code of ethics, the companies need to engage in training to stay up to date on ethical company culture. So first objective of ethics training is to develop awareness of your ethics, right? It means helping employees recognize what issues are ethical issues and what are not ethical issues. Maybe you can even do board games, right? And produce videos to try and communicate that message to them, or even invite special speakers to improve awareness of specific ethical issues. Second objective for ethics training is to achieve credibility with your employees, right? So how do you do that? Maybe, you reassure them why you're there and ensure that they are aware that you're doing this for a legit reason, right? They may be skeptical at first, like what does management have to gain from this? Because as we saw earlier, majority of people don't actually trust management and business owners to do or say the right thing. So we need to ensure that we're doing everything we can to try and gain their trust. Finally, last thing a business needs to do to be ethical is create an ethical climate, right? So there's a difference between a weak and strong ethical cultures, right? A weak ethical culture is one where if, mild or severe comments, whatever those comments be unethical comments occur, you don't say anything, right? That's clearly not good, right? Versus a strong ethical culture is you constantly reinforcing those rules and regulations. So an employee in a strong ethical culture is much less likely to actually observe abuse and sexual harassment. And they're more likely to report misconduct that they have observed. So how do we establish that ethical culture? Managers need to act ethically themselves. So if we see our boss doing the wrong thing and breaking all the rules, well then that's not gonna build a big ethical culture, now is it? Right? Top management needs to be active and committed to the company ethics program, and they need to put in place a reporting system that encourages managers and employees to report any sort of issues that they see, right? So if they see or hear of any sort of sexual harassment or sexual misconduct, you want to encourage employees and create policies and procedures in place to actually make them want to report that issue. All right, that is going to bring us to the end of our ethics and social responsibility. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.